Good morning, guys. This video is recorded for all the fitness students, those who are doing anatomy and physiology. And I'm sure you have received the slides already. The purpose of this exercise is basically to make your life easy so that you are able to learn at the comfort of your home and in your workplaces or wherever you might be. I'll go through the slides, and you will notice that the slides are taken directly from your learner guide, which is your textbook, and you just need to follow through. I'll try my best to explain every slide to the best of my ability, and I'll try to explain it and make it as logic as possible. And I know that most of you might not be familiar with the skeletal system, the muscles in your body, and all those things. So enjoy the presentation. So today I want us to look at something very important, which is the frame of the human body, which we refer to as the skeletal system. The skeletal system, as you know, that's what gives us the frame, that's what holds the body together. And if you look into your learner guide and the slides that I've sent you, is that the normal human body has got about 206 bones. Now, I'm saying the normal human body because somebody maybe who has been involved in an accident, whose legs was amputated or his arm was amputated, the person might not have 206 bones. That's why we say the normal human body has got 206 bones. And the next thing you perhaps need to know is that we've got two things that can connect the bones. The first thing that we have here is the ligaments. Now, the ligaments, as you might know, that bones don't connect to each other directly. Bones, they connect to each other via something we call the ligament. So always remember that a ligament connects a bone to another bone. I'm sure those of you who slaughtered a sheep or you've slaughtered a goat, you would have seen something that looks like a rubber. Usually when you bite it, it's very hard. So you find them right at the joints where the two bones articulate. So those are referred to as the ligaments, usually yellowish, like a rubber band in color, very hard, especially if it's not well cooked. So those are ligaments. The next thing you find, which is similar or might have even the same look, the same feel, the same taste, is called the tendons. Now the tendons, they join a bone to a muscle or a muscle to a bone. I'm not sure if you understand the difference. We said that the ligament connects a bone to another bone. For example, your femur connects to your patella via a ligament. I'm not sure if you understand that. Or your humerus connects to your radius via a ligament. So we said a tendon connects or extends from a bone to a muscle. Now, if you want to attach a muscle to a bone, that muscle can only be attached to that bone via a tendon. And then there's something that you'll see which is very important in your textbook, which you refer to as cartilage. Now, cartilage, I'm sure you might have seen it once again, even in a chicken bone. There's something that looks whitish. Many people, they like to eat it at the right on top of the long bones. It's white. It looks like plastic. I'm sure you've seen it. So we refer to that. It's called cartilage. It's not a bone, it's a cartilage. The purpose of the cartilage is also to sort of create a cushioning effect. Now, cartilages are usually found where the two bones connect. For example, in between the joints of my fingers, there are cartilages there. So in between the cartilage, you find something like saliva. We refer to that as synovial fluid. So that creates some sort of a lubrication so that when you are bending your fingers, you don't feel any pain or some sort of discomfort. So that's basically the first thing that I wanted to discuss with you. Now, moving on, you find your skeletal system. Now, as anatomy students, you have to know the skeletal system like back to back. You have to know all the major bones in your body. Now, your book, your textbook, or your learner guide, I'm sure if you have paged through, you'll notice that it explains all these bones, because the best way to know bones is to group them up, because the bones are grouped. And the second thing you need to know about the bones, you have to analyze the skeletal system in two views, as you've seen it in your textbook. The first view is the front, which we refer to the front as the anterior view of your body, meaning the front view is referred to as anterior view, and the back of the body, which is the same thing applies when we do your muscular system. The back of your body is called the posterior view. So there is no way you can understand or analyze the skeletal system or the muscular system without looking into it, into the two perspective: the front, which is anterior view, the back, which is called the posterior view. Now, if you look into your skeleton, if you analyze the skeletal system from the front, if you look right from the top, you see the head. Now, the head has got a bony structure which we refer to as the skull. The skull, basically, that's what gives your head the shape that it has. Now, just to give you some little bit of information, the skull, the main function of the skull is to protect the brain. I hope you all understand that. As much as we've got all sorts of things connected to the skull, such as your eyes and so on and so forth, but the skull is one of the hardest or the thickest bones that you have in your body. So its main function is to protect the brain from external, I'll say, enemies. For example, if somebody is hurt in an accident, it will be very rare for the impact to get into the brain, because the brain is protected by a very, very thick and heavy bone, which is called the skull. Now, if you are coming, when you come down from the skull, remember we're starting from the head and all the way down. When you come down from the skull, we see what you call the clavicle. Now, your skeletal system has got two types of names that we use. There is what we call the lay terms, which is not anatomical names of the bones. For example, the clavicle has got a lay name or a lay term, which is called the collarbone, meaning the bone that runs around the collar of your shirt. So, but you cannot use that term in your anatomy exam. You will fail, because that term is not considered as the anatomical term of that bone. But the anatomical term of that bone is called the clavicle. The clavicle is right there. So the function of the clavicle, basically, it connects your arm, which is the same as your humerus, right to the sternum. As you can see on your presentation or your slide, that the clavicle, it connects your femur or your humerus, sorry, right to your chest bone. We don't say it's the chest bone, we call it the sternum. So that's very important. Now, if you look at the sternum runs just between your rib cage, in the middle of the rib cage. Now, your ribs, they connect to the sternum. Now, right at the bottom of the sternum, you will see in the other slides, there's a little tip there which is not on this presentation or on this picture, which is called the xiphoid process. You'll see it's a little thing like a finger. It's right at the bottom of your sternum. You'll see in your next presentation, which is right in color. Now, when you look at the sternum, you see the ribs. We're going to look into the ribs later on. Your ribs are divided into three sets or three classes. You've got what we call the true ribs, which they sit right on top, meaning they connect. They are called true ribs because they connect directly to the sternum. And then we've got the second set of ribs, which we refer to as the false ribs. They connect to the sternum not directly, meaning they sort of curve into the sternum, unlike the true ribs which they connect directly. So the false ribs, they come right from the bottom and join to the sternum. And the third category of your ribs, we've got something called the false ribs. Or not the false ribs, the floating ribs. The floating ribs don't connect to the sternum, they are floating. I think it's about two sets of your ribs that are floating. Now, going down, you have your femur right there by your pelvic giggle. Now, the pelvic giggle is basically what we refer to as the hip bone. Once again, in the next presentation, I'm going to break down the components of the pelvic giggle, because the pelvic giggle is made out of a number of bones. So the pelvic giggle is one of your biggest bones that you've got. That's where you have your hip connecting. For example, your femur, it joins right at the pelvic giggle. It has a connection, or it has a socket in your pelvic giggle. Now, just to give you a little bit of information about the femur, the femur is known as the longest bone in your body. As you can see, it is a long bone. It's quite very long. So there is no bone as long as your femur in your whole body. Now, right by the femur, or in front of the femur, we see a little round thing there that most people refer to it as a kneecap. The kneecap is an informal name or a lay name. As anatomy students, we don't use that term called kneecap, but the anatomical name of the kneecap is called the patella. The patella sits right in front, or I would say, some people they say it sits between the tibia and the femur, as you can see. So you can see a little round thing there that looks like a small stone. So we refer to that as the patella. Now, going down, you see two bones that form your lower leg. Now, the names of those bones, one is called the tibia. The tibia is the big bone in your lower leg that we see usually when you are standing. And right on the side of the tibia, we see a smaller bone, which is also a long bone that is right on the side. That bone is referred to as the fibula. Now, the only way to know these terms is to memorize them. Some of them don't make sense, meaning they are not English words that you can just learn. So you just have to get down and say you memorize these terms until you know them by heart. And for your anatomical exam, this is very important. You have to know all these bones by heart. You must say them without looking at them. And then, of course, when you go down, you've got what we refer to as the ankle, which will look into the bones that form the ankle a little bit later. Now, coming up to the top, we've left something which is your arm. Now, looking at your arm, the arm basically consists of three major bones. The first one is the humerus. Humerus is basically your arm. It's a long bone that runs all the way up. It connects right at the clavicle, and then it goes all the way down to your elbow. Now, that is the humerus bone. It's one of the longest bones also in your body. And below the humerus, you've got two bones there right in your arm. The first one, we call it the radius. Radius is the bone on the side of your thumb. It's called the radius. The second one, which is on the side of your little finger there, is called the ulna. The ulna, you have to understand all these bones. And then, of course, there you've got your wrist and your fingers and all the bones that are right there. Then if you turn the guy around, now if we are going to the posterior view now, like I said, you look at the front view, which is the anterior view, and you look at the back, which is called the posterior view. Now right at your back, we see once again the skull, which protects the brain. And then we see what we call the shoulder blades. Once again, shoulder blade is not an anatomical name of that bone. The anatomical name of that bone is called the scapula. Now, as you can see that the scapula is basically the shoulder. When you are looking at it from the back, the view of the shoulder at the back, it shows you the scapula. And then right between your scapulars, the two scapulars or shoulder blades, you see a very prominent bone which is made of a number of blocks. That bone is referred to as your vertebral or your spinal column. Now, that bone you'll see in our next presentation, we're going to look at the different regions of the spinal column and look at it and see why it is important for us as fitness or anatomical students to understand the importance of the vertebral column. Now, the vertebral column, the key thing you need to know about the vertebral column is that the vertebral column, it protects the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord runs inside the vertebral column. So the main function of the vertebral column is to protect the spinal cord from any foreign objects or enemies. That's why when somebody is hurt, if your back gets hurt or somebody is involved in an accident and the spinal cord was tampered with, you find out the person is not able to walk, the person becomes paralyzed. Because you have to understand that the spinal cord is an extension, or it extends from the brain. The brain and the spinal cord, they are more like your electric system to your body. Now, if you cut these, it's like you've cut a cable. So if you cut the nerves that connects from your brain to your lower body cannot function because there's a distraction in your electric system. But you will see when we look at the different body system, you will see the importance of the spinal column and the whole nervous system. Now, basically, there isn't much to learn from the back. The main things we've covered from the front. So the back is only your two scapulars as well as the spinal column. So I want us to go on now into the specifications. Now, the next thing you look at are the types of joints in the human body. So basically, your joints are classified mainly into three. The first class of joints you have in your human body, that's what we call the synovial joints. The synovial joints are joints that have got mobility or free range of motion or a full range of motion. Joints such as your knee, your elbow, there's a full range of motion. Now, the synovial joints, as you can hear the name synovial, these joints have got synovial fluid in them. Now, synovial fluid, did we speak about it earlier on, whereby I said the synovial fluid is that it's a liquid that looks like saliva. That is more like it oils, it lubricates the joint so that there is no friction or pain when you move your leg or when you bend your knee. So the fluid, it makes the movement to be less or to be without pain. Let me put it like that. And the second joint type, we call it the cartilaginous joints, meaning cartilage. Now, these joints, there is not much movement. For example, the joints of your spinal column, they fall under the category of cartilaginous joint, meaning there is little movement. For example, yes, you can bend your back, but there are certain movements that your back cannot do. For example, my back is not as flexible as my knee. My knee can bend all the way, but my back cannot, because the type of a joint is not synovial fluid, but it's a cartilaginous joint, meaning there is very little movement that you find there. And the third category of a joint is called the fibrous joints, meaning the joints in your skull. Your skull is not just one big ball. Your skull has got some joints, but now there is no movement there, meaning fibrous joints are joints that are without any form of movements, but they are joints. And a good example will be your skull. Now let's look at the further breakdown of your joints. Joints are broken down into a number of things. You'll see when you look at your slides, the picture in your slide is more clearer than the picture in your learner guide. Now, if you look at the joints, there are defined further. In your slides, we've got A to F, the first category, and this is very important for your exam. Category number A is what we call the pivot joints. A good example of the pivot joints is in your C1 and your C2. Now, C1 or C2, they stand for the cervical region. Now, the cervical region, you'll see when we study the spinal column, the cervical region is basically the neck section of your spinal column. Now, that area is called the C area. Now, that joint, meaning your spinal column, cervical region, the movement is very limited. You can move to the left, to the right, and slightly like that. But the biggest movement you get there is this movement. That's why if you look at the picture on your slide, you can see the arrows pointing this direction and that direction. So the name of that joint is pivot joint, and a good example is your cervical region, which is between C1 and C2. The next one, very interesting, we refer to as the hinge joint. Now, the best way to understand the hinge joint is to look at your elbow. The hinge, we look at an example of a door, like the door in your house. The door in your house usually can extend to one direction, either inside or outside. For example, if you look at your elbow or your knee, for example, your elbow and your knee are good examples of a hinge joint, meaning there's one movement. Your knee cannot extend, cannot bend this way. Your knee only goes to the back. So we refer to that as a hinge joint. The same thing if you look at my elbow does this, it doesn't go beyond that, and then it comes back to that position. So that is a very good example of what we call the hinge joint. And the next one, you look at the wrist there. There is a joint. My picture doesn't show it very well. I'll get back to you to explain that further. And then you come up now to D. To D, you look at, they call it the plane joint. Those are the joints right down at your ankles, which will not focus on those joints much on this presentation because it's not a major part of your study. And then you look at joint number E, which is called the condyloid joint. Once again, a good example is your wrist, and once again, won't focus much on that joint because we don't do much of those muscles or those joints as part of your study. And then, of course, very important, F, we call it the ball and the socket joint. The ball and the socket joint, as you can see, a good example is your femur, even your humerus. We call it the ball and socket because the long bone has got a ball at the end. So that ball, it goes into the pelvic giggle. So the femur or the humerus has got a ball at the end of the joint. I'm sure you've seen it. If you've slaughtered a cow before or you slaughtered a goat, you see that the long bones have got a head, and that head goes into a socket. That's why we call those bones ball and socket. Once again, you get the best movements. Your ball and socket joints, they've got great mobility than any joint because they're a ball and socket. So usually you find that your hip, you can move in all types of directions because it's a ball and socket joint. Now, we need to know a few things about the joints, which are more like the attributes of a joint. Number one, synovial joint, they've got a cavity, meaning there is a ball and there's a socket. And the next thing, there's a synovial membrane. Like we said earlier on, the synovial membrane, you find that fluid inside that lubricates or makes the movement to be nice and easy. So it's more like your oil in the car. If the car has no oil, or if a screw has no oil, so it makes the movement of that screw to be very rusty and very much uncomfortable. Now let's look at what you see. The next slide is bones, ligaments, and cartilages. We did look at this earlier on, but if you look at the slide I'm at now, the only difference here is that it's in color. And I must say to you, if you want to understand anatomy and physiology, you have to study these in color. When you see them in color, you can see the color of the ligament, you can see the color of the cartilage, you can see the exact color of the bone. So in the next slides, they've used some colors as much as they are not the correct colors. But what is important is that the bone is a different color and the ligament is a different color, which makes it easy for you to understand that it's not one and the same thing. Now, back to the bones. The skeletal system, as I mentioned earlier on, you've got 206 bones. That's a lot of bones. And as anatomy and physiology students, we have to understand and know all these bones. Now, the best way to learn bones is to group them into various sections. For example, the 206 bones, they are classified in this slide. For example, if you look at the skull, we've got 22 bones that form the skull, which is very interesting. Now, next to the skull, you can see on the picture or your slide, you've got 33 bones that form your back or your spinal column or your vertebral column. Remember, it's one and the same thing. Some people refer to it as a vertebral column. Some people refer to it as a spinal column. It's one and the same thing. That there you've got 33 bones, which we'll look at in detail later on. Those bones, they form your back or they form your spinal column. And we've got 64 bones that form shoulder giggle as well as the upper limb. As you can see there, you have to understand that the body has got the upper and the lower limbs. Now, some books refer to the limbs as your lower and upper extremities, which is one and the same thing. And the good picture we have there, you've got your clavicle as well as your scapula. And if you look at all those bones, they come up to 64 bones. Now, remember, we look at the right and the left arm together with the wrist and the fingers. So those bones are quite a lot. And then very important, you see your ribs, which is your rib cage. They refer to that as the thoracic cage. There you see we've got 25 ribs, which come up, 25 bones, which come up from the ribs, the sternum, as well as some other bones that you might find around that area. And then the next one is your lower extremity or your lower limbs combined with the pelvic giggle. Remember, we said your pelvic giggle is your hip bone. And also part of those bones, we've got your ankle and your foot. Those fingers also, they make up a big number of your lower limbs. So we've got 62 bones in total there. And like I said, I would advise you to go download an app on your phone or on your tablet, or you can get a software on your computer that explains this even further. There's no way you can learn anatomy without studying further on your own. You have to look at different books, look at different views. When I was studying anatomy, one of the things I used to do after every class, I'll go to the library and find more books, because you have to look at this from different angles. That's the best way to understand it. Now, the next one, we look at the 5 classes, if you like. Bones can be classified into 5 groups. The first group we look at, that's what we call the short bones. Now, the short bones, you can see these are little pieces of bones that we found on the ankle and also on the wrist. And the next one, we call it the flat bone. A good example of a flat bone can be found on your skull. And the next one, we've got the long bone. The long bone, it's literally long because you can see that the bone is long. A good example is your femur and your humerus, as discussed earlier on. And you've got what we call the irregular bones. A good example will be the bones of your spinal column. And then, of course, finally, we've got what we call the sesamoid bone. A good example there will be your patella or your kneecap. So once again, this is very important for your exam. My advice is that you go and study this further so that you can understand it more. Now, the next slide, we're looking at the flat bones in detail. As you can see, once again, this is in color. The flat bones, you can see good examples. They are called flat bones because they are literally flat. A good example is your sternum. You can see they've used the green or blue shade. The next one is your scapula. I'm sure now you are very much familiar with the terms. And once again, the ribs also, they are classified as flat bones because they are flat. And once again, as you can see, the skull is also classified as an example of a flat bone. Moving forward, you see long bones. Like I said, they are called long bones because they are long in length. A good example is your tibia, is your fibia, is your femur, is your humerus, is your ulna, is your radius. Now, these are classical example of long bones. Once again, go and learn and study this. You'll notice that anatomy is not hard. The only price you need to pay is to love it and study it further so that you can speak these bones and say them without looking at them. And we look now at something very important, which is called the exoskeleton. Exoskeleton, basically, we're looking at the rib cage combined with the skull and the vertebral column. Now, once again, I just want to introduce this subject now. I believe that the next slides, they look into this into further details. So as you can see, it's shaded in green, which is the exoskeleton. We said it's broken down into your skull, your rib cage or your thoracic cage, as well as your backbone, which we refer to as the vertebral column. Now, very important, I want us to look at the bones of the vertebral column. Now, the next slide, you can see it is in color. And earlier on, we gave you the number of those bones. But now you can see that we've used 4 colors. Color number 1 is red, color number 2 is blue, color number 3 is yellow, and color number 4 is green. Now you can see right there on top, we've got what we call the cervical region. Now the cervical region is highlighted in red. The cervical region is basically your neck, if you may allow me to use that word. That's your neck. That's where you've got the cervical region. And the next one is in blue. Your thoracic region is basically the biggest part of your spinal column. And a good example is to use the word your back. That's your upper back, meaning your upper back is made of 12 blocks of bones, which is called the thoracic region. And the next one is your lumbar. Your lumbar is your lower back. That's where pregnant women feel the pain. You will see when we do the spinal disorders how the lumbar area or the lumbar region comes into play. So here we've got 5 blocks of bones, and that area looks thick because it carries the whole weight of your body. And then right at the bottom, we've got 5 blocks. We refer to that area as the sacrum. And of course, there's a tip there that is not showed much, that is highlighted in purple. That is called the coccyx, which is 4 blocks, but very, very tiny. And we'll look into that later on. If you look at the figure on your left on the same slide, you can see how these are now put into your body and how it looks in your body when you are standing. And the next one we want to look at are the bones or the thoracic region, which is the rib cage. Now, before I get into that, the rib cage has got one main function. The function of the rib cage is basically to protect the internal organs. Now, as you know that the heart and other vital organs of your body are inside there. So just like we said, the spinal column protects the spinal cord. The skull protects the brain. Now we are saying the thoracic cage or the rib cage protects your main organs, which your heart is part of. Now let's look at it into details. Now remember, earlier on we spoke about the different classes of your ribs. Now this slide talks to that presentation. You can see it is in color. The first thing we look at are the true ribs. You can see that there are 7 classes of your true ribs. As you look at these slides, we call them true ribs because they connect directly to the sternum. Now remember, earlier on we spoke about that little tip at the bottom called the xiphoid process. You can see it now, it's highlighted nicely in gray. At the second category of your ribs, it's classes 8 to 12. We refer to these as the false ribs. As you can see that they attach to the sternum, not directly. And then of course we've got class number 1 and 12. As you can see, it's very clear on this picture. We call these the floating ribs, meaning they are floating. They are not connecting to the sternum at all. They are just hanging on their own. Now, if you look at this presentation, it gives you a very nice picture of the thoracic region, or the thoracic or the rib cage. The next one, we look at the hip, the shoulder, the arm, and the legs. I think we've looked at this earlier on. You can see it once again in color, that you've got your lower, your upper extremities, you've got your pelvic giggle. And I believe that in the next 1 or 2 slides, we'll be looking at the pelvic giggle and the various bones or components that make up that bone. So I won't spend much time on this slide because we did speak on it earlier on. Once again, the next one is it shows us the shoulder giggle. Once again, you are aware now of the scapula, which is the shoulder blade in the lay terms, and you are aware of the clavicle, which is called the collarbone in the lay terms. Bones of the upper limb, we spoke about this already. You've got the arm, which is made of the 3 main bones. Number 1, we've got the humerus, and we've got the 2 bones below the humerus, which we refer to as the ulna and the radius. And the next slide, we have the bones of the pelvic giggle. Now, the pelvic giggle, you can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, and 5 components there. So these bones, you have to know them. They might come up in your exam. The main thing you need to know that the pelvic giggle is what we refer to as the hip bone, meaning that's around your core area. And we did study earlier on that your femur, which is the longest bone in your body, it connects directly into the pelvic giggle. Now, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. The next presentation will be looking at the spinal disorders or the spinal deformities, which there are 3. It's a very short presentation. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Like I said earlier on, the best way for you to understand this presentation is to go and look into other sources. And if you can download an app, there are a number of apps that make this even nicer and clearer, whereby you can learn it in color. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next presentation. Bye.